Hi there. I thought I'd do a short reflection on the scripture readings that have been suggested for churches to read this Sunday. It is the 25th of June, or the fourth Sunday after Pentecost, and the readings that have been suggested are from Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 21, and Matthew's Gospel chapter 10, verse 24 to 39. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those, and then start the video again. We need connection with family, but family can be painful, and sometimes family are not safe to be around. I hope that we can form places where folks can reconnect when family is hard, and places where we can share our joys and sorrows beyond the borders of family. For a long time now, it seems like Australian Christians, or a lot of Australian Christians, have been influenced by an idea that comes from the US American religious right, the idea of so-called family values. This talk about family values tends to look back into the past, often to the 1950s, and imagine that things were so much better back then. Back then, the story goes, every family had a dad who was the head of the household, who went out to work during the week and read the paper and mowed the lawn and cooked barbecues on the weekend, and a mum who stayed at home to do the work of caring for everyone in the household, and kids who respected their parents, being seen and not heard. Back then, marriage had to be between a man and a woman, and marriage was for life. And there were no problems, supposedly, with substance abuse or crime. This imagining of family values says that what we need to do is go back to this imagining of the past. Apparently, we need to bring back male headship in the household. We need to bring back corporal punishment in schools, and we need to get rid of feminism and gay rights. When Christians promote this idea, it gives the impression that every Christian should be part of a neatly ordered family with a mum and a dad and their biological kids under one roof, the nuclear family. When Christians promote this particular idea of family values, I wonder, what does it say to folks who don't fit into this vision of family? What does it mean for a single parent who wants to bring their kids to church, or for a queer couple who would like to be part of the church but don't know if there's somewhere where they would be welcome to bring their family? What does it mean for many folks in our society who are exploring other forms of family and relationship, trying to work out how they lovingly navigate relationships with multiple partners as people are in our society, with a sincere conviction that love is not subject to scarcity? Does it mean that they're not welcome, or that they feel like this is part of their experience that they need to hide away in church? And even if our families and relationships look a lot like a nuclear family, what does it mean for us when life in our families is painful? It seems like it'd be simple to try and just go back to what we might imagine as a more wholesome time when everything was clear and straightforward. But I think it actually means that all of us feel like there's some part of ourselves and our families that we can't bring to church, because of feeling like we have to have everything looking nice and orderly. In reality, things are not perfect like they're imagined to have been back in the 1950s. And the vision of a family presented in this idea of family values, it isn't even really that traditional. Throughout the scripture, there's a very different understanding of family in play. In that part of the ancient world where our sacred stories take place, there were no nuclear families. Households were big and multi-generational, led by the most senior male of the family. And wealthy households would also include slaves who were not equal to biological members of the family, but who were provided for. And wealthy households would often have other less powerful families who were not slaves, but were economically dependent on the big household as well. We have a pretty horrible family story in today's reading from Genesis. And there's no way of making this fit into the narrow confines of family values. We have a story of a family in a really painful mess. We have an unequal situation in the household, and we have conflict over power and inheritance. Abraham has two sons with different mothers, one son Isaac with his wife Sarah, and an older son Ishmael with Hagar, who was a slave of the household belonging to Sarah. Between the two sons, there's a power imbalance. Ishmael is the older brother, and so he should be the one who becomes the patriarch when Abraham dies. But between their mothers, there's an opposite imbalance. Sarah literally owns Hagar, and she has the power to tell her husband what is going to happen with her. This might not be what we expect if we presume that the man was always the most powerful person in the household. Abraham does the unthinkable. He sends Ishmael and Hagar out into the wilderness to fend for themselves, banishing them from the household. But the story says that God has not rejected Hagar and Ishmael. God is still with them in their isolation and suffering. God listens to Hagar's desperate prayers and provides for her and her son. The family is separated, but both of the children are raised up to become great ancestors of great nations. Family values doesn't get much of a run in today's gospel reading either. Instead, we hear painful predictions about Jesus dividing families. It doesn't mean that he's saying that we should intentionally push our families away if they have different beliefs from us, as some sectarian groups have said. But Jesus is not a polite and respectable champion of the nuclear family. We might remember that over the last few Sundays, we've had a continuing story of Jesus interacting with households. First, he was sighted at a dinner party in a disreputable household, and then he allowed himself to be interrupted by a chronically bleeding woman who would have been considered unclean and probably had no household to look after her welfare. And then he was welcomed into a respectable but unclean household as an unclean healer. Last Sunday, we heard Jesus sending people out and telling them to stay in whichever household will have them as they travel about ministering to people who suffer. And then today we hear him talking about dividing households. The community that produced this gospel would have been experiencing this. All the early followers of Jesus had been Jewish people who followed the Torah, ate kosher, observed the Sabbath, attended the synagogue. Jesus was a Jewish person seeking to reform his own faith. He wasn't trying to start a new religion. But by the time that this gospel was written, the Jewish temple had been destroyed by Rome. There'd been a rebellion, and in response to that, the Romans had destroyed the temple. And after that, there was a clear split between Christians and Jews. It was agreed by Jewish people that following Jesus wasn't a legitimate way of being Jewish, and so Christians were no longer allowed in the synagogues. This split would have caused great pain for Jewish households, where some had chosen to follow Christ. It seems that Jesus is very aware that the movement he is starting will disrupt families and households, even as it seeks to create a new household that has room for people who haven't been welcome elsewhere. He says he knows the pain that they have to endure. He cares about their suffering. He says he pays attention to the lives of small creatures that humans pay little attention to. He sees the sparrows and cares for them. Of course, he also sees their suffering and is with them in their suffering. This week, a lot of us have been shocked by stories of death and suffering at sea, with the implosion of the Titan submarine and the sinking of a fishing boat that was ferrying refugees to Italy. These stories have gotten unequal levels of media attention, and we've heard a lot about the passengers on the Titan, and we know almost nothing about the refugees. But God knows the lives of all the unknown masses who suffer. Jesus' vision is for a household that has room for all kinds of rejected people who do not fit into someone's idea of a traditional family or have been rejected by family or who are without a safe homeland. In the meantime, He's with humanity in our suffering and division. He's experiencing it as well. We're invited to be part of the work of creating a society that has room for people of all kinds, where we can all bring our true selves to the table. So I'm just going to repeat what I said at the start, because this is the gist of what I've been trying to say in response to these stories. We need a connection with family, but family can be painful. Sometimes family are not safe to be around, like in the story from Genesis. And I hope we can form places where folks can reconnect when family is hard, places where we can share our joys and sorrows beyond the borders of family.